Something unexpected happened in the Strait of Hormuz. One of the world's most heavily monitored waterways became a reminder of something many strategists already knew. Control in modern conflict isn't just about military strength. It's about geography, economics, and timing. Why Hormuz matters. The Persian Gulf is one of the most strategically important energy corridors on Earth. At the center of it lies the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage that connects the Gulf to the open ocean. On a map, it may not look particularly dramatic, but in reality, it is one of the most critical choke points in the global economy. Every day, a significant portion of the world's energy supply flows through this corridor. Estimates often suggest that around 20% of global oil trade passes through the strait. That includes shipments from major producers like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar. This isn't just about oil. Liquefied natural gas, especially from Qatar, also moves through these waters, supplying energy to markets across Asia and Europe. In other words, what happens here doesn't stay here. It directly affects fuel prices, electricity costs, and economic stability across continents. Now, here's where the geography becomes critical. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is roughly 54 kilometers wide. That might sound like a decent distance, but for global shipping, it's far more constrained than it appears, because ships don't move freely across the entire width. Instead, they are restricted to designated shipping lanes, two narrow corridors for inbound and outbound traffic, separated by a buffer zone. Each lane is only a few kilometers wide. That means massive oil tankers, some of the largest moving structures on Earth, are navigating through extremely tight, predictable paths. This transforms the strait from a wide-open passage into something much more fragile. It's not a highway, it's a bottleneck. And bottlenecks, by their nature, are vulnerable. Even minor disruptions, whether logistical, environmental, or geopolitical, can ripple outward quickly. A single incident can delay shipments, raise insurance costs, and trigger reactions in global markets within hours. That's why the Strait of Hormuz is often described not just as a trade route, but as a pressure point. Because control over a choke point like this isn't just about physical presence. It's about influence over flow, over the movement of resources that modern economies depend on every single day. And that's what makes this narrow stretch of water so important, not its size, but its impact. The strategy. In theory, controlling a choke point like the Strait of Hormuz seems relatively straightforward. You deploy naval assets into the region, you monitor commercial shipping lanes, and if necessary, you apply pressure to regulate or restrict movement. On paper, it's a clean, structured approach, something that fits well within traditional military planning. And when it comes to capability, few forces in the world can match the reach and power of the United States Navy. With advanced aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, submarines, and surveillance systems, the U.S. Navy has spent decades building the ability to operate across every major ocean. It is designed for dominance, projecting power, securing sea lanes, and maintaining a global presence. So, at first glance, the logic seems simple. If you have overwhelming naval strength, you should be able to control a narrow maritime corridor. But real-world conditions rarely follow theoretical models. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not open ocean, it's a confined, highly sensitive environment where geography shapes everything. Unlike vast seas where fleets can maneuver freely, this region forces ships into tight, predictable routes. The designated shipping lanes are narrow, heavily trafficked, and constantly monitored, not just by one actor, but by multiple stakeholders with overlapping interests. That creates a fundamentally different kind of operational challenge. In open waters, naval power is about mobility and reach. In confined spaces like Hormuz, it becomes about precision, coordination, and constant awareness. Every movement matters. Every decision carries risk, and the margin for error becomes extremely small. There's also another layer to this complexity: density. At any given time, the strait is filled with commercial vessels, oil tankers, patrol ships, and regional maritime traffic. It's not a controlled military zone. It's an active economic artery. That means any attempt to control it has to account for civilian shipping, international law, and the risk of unintended escalation, because even a minor miscalculation in such a crowded environment can have disproportionate consequences. A delay, a warning signal, or even a misinterpreted maneuver could quickly ripple outward, affecting not just the immediate area, but global trade flows. This is where theory begins to diverge from reality. What looks manageable on a map becomes far more complex on the water. Because control isn't just about presence, it's about sustainability. Maintaining constant surveillance, ensuring safe passage for neutral shipping, and avoiding escalation, all at the same time, requires more than just military strength. It requires balance. And in a place like the Strait of Hormuz, that balance is incredibly difficult to maintain. Which is why, despite advanced capabilities, operating in such an environment is never as simple as it first appears. The real challenge. For decades, Iran has approached the security of the Strait of Hormuz in a very different way than traditional naval powers. Instead of trying to match larger fleets ship for ship, it developed what military analysts call an asymmetric strategy. That means focusing not on winning a direct confrontation, but on making that confrontation difficult, costly, and unpredictable. Because competing directly with a navy like the United States would require massive resources, advanced fleets, and global logistics. But disrupting a narrow waterway, that's a different kind of challenge, and one that doesn't require dominance. It requires precision, timing, and persistence. Over the years, Iran has built a layered approach designed specifically for this environment. At the center of it are three key tools: coastal missile systems, fast attack boats, and naval mines. Let's break that down. Along its coastline, Iran has deployed anti-ship missile systems that can target vessels moving through the strait. These systems are often mobile, meaning they can be repositioned quickly, making them harder to detect and neutralize. Their role isn't to control the sea, but to threaten movement through it. Then there are fast attack boats. Small, agile, and often operating in groups, these vessels are designed for speed rather than endurance. They can approach quickly, create uncertainty, and withdraw just as fast. According to recent reporting, such boats are a core part of Iran's layered defense, capable of hit-and-run operations that complicate any naval response. And finally, naval mines. These are among the simplest but most effective tools in this strategy. Mines are relatively inexpensive, difficult to detect, and can remain active for long periods. Even a limited number placed in key shipping lanes can force vessels to slow down, reroute, or wait for clearance operations. And that's the key point. Iran doesn't need to completely shut down the strait to have a global impact. Even small disruptions can increase shipping risk, drive up insurance costs, delay cargo movement. And once uncertainty enters the system, the effects spread far beyond the region. This approach is often described as area denial, not controlling the space outright, but making it dangerous enough that others hesitate to use it freely. And in a place like the Strait of Hormuz, that can be enough. Because global trade depends on reliability, it depends on predictability, and when those things are disrupted, even slightly, the consequences are immediate. So the real challenge here isn't about who has the bigger navy. It's about who can shape the environment. And in a narrow, high-stakes corridor like Hormuz, disruption, not dominance, can define the outcome. Global impact. The moment tensions rise in the Strait of Hormuz, global markets react almost instantly, not hours later, not days later, but in real time. Because this narrow stretch of water is deeply connected to the global economy. It's not just a regional route, it's a central artery for energy and trade moving between the Middle East, Asia, Europe, and beyond. So when uncertainty enters the picture, the effects begin to spread immediately. One of the first areas to respond is shipping insurance. Companies that insure cargo vessels, especially those operating in high-risk zones, quickly reassess the situation. If tensions rise, premiums increase, sometimes sharply. In extreme cases, certain routes may even be classified as too risky without special coverage. That means higher operating costs for shipping companies. And those costs don't stay within the industry. They move outward into the price of goods, energy, and transportation. At the same time, trade routes begin to shift. Instead of passing through the Gulf, some vessels may choose longer alternative routes to avoid risk. One common option is rerouting around the southern tip of Africa via the Cape of Good Hope. But this isn't a small adjustment. It can add days or even weeks to a journey. More fuel is consumed. Schedules are disrupted. Delivery timelines stretch. And in a global economy that depends on precision and timing, even small delays can have cascading effects. Factories waiting for raw materials slow down production. Retail supply chains face shortages or delays. Energy importing countries begin to feel pressure on reserves and pricing. This is where the real impact becomes clear. Even countries not directly involved in the situation, countries thousands of kilometers away, begin to feel the consequences. Because modern supply chains don't operate in isolation. They are interconnected systems. A disruption in one region can trigger reactions across multiple industries and continents. What starts as a localized tension quickly becomes a global concern, and energy markets are especially sensitive to this. Oil and gas prices often respond not just to actual supply disruptions, but to perceived risk. The possibility that flows could be interrupted is sometimes enough to drive prices upward. That affects everything from fuel costs to electricity prices to inflation. So when people hear about tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, it's not just a distant geopolitical issue. It's something that can influence daily life in very real ways. The cost of transportation, the price of goods, and the stability of economies. That's why this region holds such weight in global discussions. Because in today's interconnected world, a narrow waterway can have a wide impact. Regional calculations. Now here's where things start to get more complex, because when tensions rise in the Persian Gulf, the countries closest to it are not just observers, they are directly affected. Nations like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar sit at the heart of this region. Their economies, infrastructure, and global roles are deeply tied to the stability of Gulf waters, and that shapes how they respond. Because their decisions aren't driven only by politics or alliances, they're driven by something more immediate: economic continuity. Take energy exports, for example. Saudi Arabia is one of the world's largest oil producers. A significant portion of its exports moves through Gulf shipping routes. Any disruption, whether temporary or prolonged, can affect delivery schedules, pricing stability, and long-term contracts. The same applies to the United Arab Emirates. The UAE has positioned itself as a global hub for trade, logistics, and finance. Ports like Jebel Ali connect regional markets to international supply chains. Stability isn't just beneficial for the UAE, it's essential. Then there's Qatar, one of the world's leading exporters of liquefied natural gas. Its shipments travel across the same waters, supplying energy to countries that rely on consistent delivery cycles. Even minor disruptions can create uncertainty in energy markets far beyond the region. So when tensions rise, these countries face a difficult calculation. On one side, there are long-standing security partnerships and geopolitical alignments. On the other, there are immediate economic realities that cannot be ignored. If shipping slows down, if costs increase, if investor confidence begins to shift, the impact is felt quickly and directly within their economies. This is why their approach is often more measured and flexible than it might appear from the outside. Because for them, stability is not an abstract goal, it's a requirement. And when disruptions begin to affect trade and energy flows, priorities can shift accordingly. This doesn't necessarily mean dramatic changes or sudden moves. More often, it leads to subtle adjustments, careful diplomatic engagement, maintaining multiple channels of communication, balancing relationships across different regional and global actors. These strategies are not new. They've been part of Gulf diplomacy for decades. Because in a region where geography connects everyone and where economic systems are tightly linked, rigid positions can carry high risks. Flexibility, on the other hand, creates options, and in uncertain environments, options matter. So when you look at how these countries respond to rising tensions in the Gulf, it's important to understand the underlying logic. It's not just about choosing sides, it's about managing risk, protecting economic stability, and ensuring that no matter how the situation evolves, they remain positioned to adapt. Because in the end, for these states, stability in the Gulf isn't just important, it's foundational. A shift in approach. Historically, regional powers have balanced security partnerships, economic interests, diplomatic channels. Even during tensions, communication often continues behind the scenes. Because in regions like this, geography doesn't change, neighbors remain neighbors. Limits of power. This situation highlights an important reality. Military strength alone doesn't guarantee outcomes, especially in environments where geography favors defense. Costs of escalation are high. Multiple actors are involved. It becomes less about control and more about management. What comes next? So what happens now? The answer isn't simple, but one thing is clear. The future of the region will likely involve more diplomacy, more balancing, and more complex relationships. Because in the Middle East, stability isn't created by force alone, it's negotiated.